Hello and welcome to the spinal cord connections video lecture. So to begin, you should first print out one of these worksheets so that you can follow along and fill in the blanks here. So I wanted to do this worksheet because it's really difficult in a lot of textbooks to get the big picture on how things flow into your spinal cord and how things, and the things in this case being neurons and nerves, how all those things flow in and out of the spinal cord. So here we're going to look in a fair amount of detail on the various structures involved leading into the spinal cord and leading out of the spinal cord, seeing where the sensory neurons are, where the motor neurons are, and kind of get a general idea here. Okay, so we're going to start off first labeling the parts of the spinal cord and associated spinal cord structures. So first of all, you should be able to determine whether this side is ventral or dorsal and whether this side is ventral or dorsal. You should be able to do this after we do our spinal cord lecture. So hopefully you can tell that this part of the spinal cord is more tapered. It's a little bit sharper, and this part's kind of more wide. So that's a clue that this side is going to be the dorsal side right here. So dorsal side because more tapered gray matter here. And that must mean that this is the ventral side of the spinal cord. And by the way, this is a slice of a lower lumbar spinal cord. And it's just a cross section of that lower lumbar level. In other words, it's a transverse section. So this part of the spinal cord is our gray matter. Gray matter contains mostly cell bodies, so the cell bodies of neurons are going to be found there for the most part. And then surrounding it is going to be our white matter. And white matter consists mostly of axons. There are some specific subsections of this gray matter that are going to be important to distinguish between. And so this top part of the gray matter, which also is going to be on this side as well, but we're just going to label it on the right hand side here. So up until this dotted line, we call this area the dorsal horn. Dorsal horn because it's on the dorsal side. Some people might call it the posterior horn as well. Another area of the gray matter would be this side. So of course, since this is on the ventral side, this is going to be called the ventral horn. We'll talk about the significance of those two in a little bit. Then this section here, we're not going to really talk much about in this video lecture, but that area is called the lateral horn. And it's not always present throughout the spinal cord, but in some spinal cord areas, you'll find a lateral horn. And I just thought I'd kind of put it in there to get in case it helps you later on. All right. So this is our main part of the spinal cord. Moving laterally from here, this structure is called the dorsal root, also known as the posterior root. This is going to contain neurons in it. Then that makes this guy here the ventral root, also known as the anterior root. This more bulbous structure that is attached to the end of the dorsal root is called the dorsal root ganglion. And oftentimes you don't see it written out as dorsal root ganglion. Most of the time you'll see it just shorthand as DRG. What is a ganglion? It's an area where there's lots of cell bodies. So a concentration of cell bodies can be found in those areas. After this dorsal root ganglion, we're getting the ventral root merging with this structure here. And as they merge together, that becomes a new structure. That is then officially the start of a spinal nerve. So right about there. Start of spinal nerve. And you have lots of spinal nerves coming out of your spinal cord, but right here we're just having one at this lower lumbar spinal cord level that's coming out to the right hand side. All of these structures would also be present on the left side here, but there was just no way to fit it on the page, so that's why it's missing there. But you can sort of mirror image everything that we're doing here today to the other side. So really at this level you have one on the right hand side and one on the left hand side. 2 spinal nerves per section. This spinal nerve is going to continue and then branch out into 2 new structures. The structure that is going to branch anteriorly or ventrally is called the ventral ramus, also known as the anterior ramus. This ventral ramus is a lot thicker in diameter, a lot bigger in diameter than this guy here, which is known as the dorsal ramus or posterior ramus. All right, so those are all the most important structures that we want to label for our discussion in this video lecture. The other structures that we have not labeled that you see on this part of the worksheet have to do with neurons related to the autonomic nervous system. So that is like the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. Due to the complexity of that stuff, we're going to avoid it in this video lecture and focus on the a little bit simpler stuff. So let's start drawing a legend here at the top left. I'm going to use my blue pen to represent any afferent, which is also known as sensory neurons. And so as a reminder, these sensory neurons are coming from somatic sensory receptors. We're not going to deal with afferent sensory neurons coming from visceral receptors. We're just going to focus on somatic receptors here. And then in red will indicate or will represent efferent motor neurons. And in this specific worksheet, we're going to be dealing with these motor neurons that are coming from the central nervous system and then going to skeletal muscle. So I want to do something that maybe we can, that feels comfortable, feels like you could, what's the word for this? You could tie it to real life, I guess. I'm not really sure what the right word is, but let's say that you feel your phone vibrate in your pants pocket. So in this case, the phone is going to be in your pants pocket, touching the anterior portion of your thigh, right? So if you got a pocket in the anterior portion of your thigh and your phone's sitting against your skin there, we're going to pretend that that phone is going to vibrate. We're going to track how does the neuron and where does the neuron go to send that vibrational stimulus eventually to your brain. And then we're going to pretend that you want to kick in response to feeling that phone vibrating. So I know that's not normal. People don't normally decide to kick their leg when their phone vibrates, but we're gonna, for the sake of simplicity in this example, think about that. So phone vibrating, then that information is gonna go to your brain. You're gonna decide, oh, I wanna kick now, because my phone just vibrated and I'm training myself to do it, and then you're gonna kick. So to be clear, this is not a reflex that we're gonna be drawing. Not drawing a reflex, but we're drawing the decision to kick after receiving that specific stimulus. So we're gonna start with the blue pen here, and the sensory receptor is going to be, in this case, in the skin in your anterior portion of the thigh, right where your phone is vibrating against your thigh. So we can draw this, maybe something looking like a paper clip or like a little onion. This will be our somatic sensory receptor. Located in the anterior portion of thigh. And specifically, this receptor that detects vibration is found in the skin on top of your thigh. The name of the receptor is called a Pacinian corpuscle. So Pacinian corpuscles that are found in your skin, they're really good and they are specialized to detect vibration. And so you have these Pacinian corpuscles all over your skin, all over your body. However, because we're dealing with it in the thigh just for now, that's why I'm writing it as in the thigh. So this is what's going to be detecting the vibration. It's a modified dendritic end here that will be containing receptors that are really good at detecting vibration. And where is that going to send the information to? Well, it's going to take information via action potentials through this neuron. And the neuron is first going to be entering this ventral ramus. Why does it go through the ventral ramus? Why not through the dorsal ramus? Well, it's because the receptor's in the anterior or ventral part of the body. And if the receptor is found in the ventral or anterior part of the body, it has to come in through this ramus. So we can continue drawing our neuron here. It's going to enter the DRG. It's not going to enter this ventral root. Stops in here. Remember, ganglions are where there are a lot of cell bodies. So I'm going to draw this thick dot here to represent the cell body of this neuron. And then the axon will continue through the dorsal root. The axon goes into this gray matter, specifically in the dorsal horn. Now remember, the gray matter is composed mostly of cell bodies, but that doesn't mean axons can't exist here. So the axon is just going to, enter it to some degree, and then it's going to sort of jump across. So now the axon's in the white matter. And from here, it's going to go up. It's going to go up your spinal cord, so superiorly up your spinal cord towards your brain. In other words, so the stimulus, which is vibrational in this case, goes to the brain, but specifically in the brain, it's going to go to the part of your brain that detects sensory information. And that is the primary somatosensory cortex. So, by the way, it doesn't have to be vibrational stimulus, but let's say if somebody poked you in the anterior part of their thigh, a different type of sensory receptor, not really Pacinian corpuscle, but some other type of receptor found there, is going to detect the touch or the pushing against your thigh, and it'll send information through this exact same route. And then also to the primary somatosensory cortex. But it does not have to be only vibrational information. So that's the first half of the picture of figuring out how information is transmitted through the nervous system. Now, the second half of this is, now that it's in your brain, that information's in your brain and you're becoming conscious of the fact that your phone is vibrating, the second half is we want to make the decision to kick. So the type of kick I'm talking about is we need to contract the quadriceps femoris. And by contracting the quadriceps femoris, you end up kicking forwards. So I'm going to take my red pen now, and we're going to write up here where that decision is made in your brain. So that conscious decision, right, that voluntary decision to move or contract skeletal muscle, in this case, the skeletal muscle is the quads or quadriceps femoris. That comes from the primary motor cortex. So in that primary motor cortex, you're making the conscious decision, and that is going to cause action potentials to go from that primary motor cortex down the spinal cord, inferiorly down the spinal cord, and eventually that information is going to go to this lower lumbar spinal cord level, and it's going to hit this lateral area of the white matter. From here, it's going to sort of jump over into this ventral horn region, and the axon terminals of this efferent motor neuron are going to synapse with another motor neuron. So here I'm drawing a cell body of a second motor neuron. And this one extends through the ventral root, continues into the spinal nerve area. And then from the spinal nerve area, it has sort of a decision here. Is this neuron going to go through the ventral ramus, or is it going to go through the dorsal ramus? So here we have to keep in mind the goal. The goal is to contract a muscle in the anterior portion of the body, which is the quadriceps femoris. Because that muscle is found in the anterior or ventral part of the body, that means that the motor neuron has to go through the ventral ramus. So that's why we're going to go through here. And so the axon terminals are going to innervate skeletal muscle And in our example here, we're thinking the quads. And the goal is so that we can cause a kick. So test questions might involve, say, if you had a severing of the dorsal root, what direct effect would that have on sensation or motor functions, or would they actually affect both if you severed this? So an easy way to answer that is, okay, if you were to break this, what is contained inside of here? What is being destroyed? If you were to break this, you're breaking apart sensory connections. So sensory information would no longer be able to get to your brain. You would still be able to make motor movements because this is still intact, this is still intact, your brain is still intact, this part's still intact. So you could still do motor movements, but you wouldn't be able to sense things. But what if you had some sort of lesion or otherwise damaged start of the spinal nerve? What if something was cut all the way through this? Then what would that affect? Sensory information, motor information, or both? So because there's sensory neurons coming through here and motor neurons coming through that way, if you were to cut that, it's going to destroy both functions in this part of the body. Cool. So I want to point out that the ventral ramus, the reason why it's bigger is because majority of the time the neurons are there, you have more things that are being innervated in the front of your body. There's not as many things that are being innervated in the back. but there's still, of course, neurons that are going through this area too. An example would be, let's say if somebody, I don't know if you guys are familiar with corn dogging, but it was back when I was in elementary school and kind of into middle school, people were, sort of mean, and they'd corn dog you, which is sort of, they'd grab your shoulders from behind you, and then they'd kind of knee you in the hamstrings. So they basically knee you in the hamstrings, and it almost makes you fall over. So because somebody's kneeing you in the hamstrings, that sensation is being detected in the posterior part of the body. So in that case, you'd have sensory neurons coming from the posterior side, going through the spinal nerve, entering the dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal root, up to the brain, and then, what kind of decision are you going to make in the primary motor cortex after somebody corn dogs you? I don't know, maybe you'll try to kangaroo kick them or something, right? So let's say you're gonna, let's say you want to contract your hamstrings, and by contracting your hamstrings, you're gonna end up kicking sort of backwards, because you want to pay back, right? So in that case, there would be a conscious decision to make your hamstring skeletal muscle contract. That information will be sent down the side of the white matter. The neuron would synapse with another motor neuron here, which goes to the ventral root. But in that case, that motor neuron would end up turning through the dorsal ramus, because in order to innervate your hamstrings, which are in the posterior side of your body or dorsal side of your body, that's the direction the motor neuron would have to go. All right, so that concludes the video lecture on spinal cord connections. Make sure that you understand, if you were to sever connections in different kind of spots, what functions would be affected, sensory, motor, or both. Know what the different parts are called, and you should also know the order of the neurons flowing through the structures. So know that sensory neurons will first go through the ramus, and then through a spinal nerve, and then through a dorsal root ganglion, etc. You might be tested on that order. All right, thank you for watching.